years between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, lots of people immigrated to America from Europe. One of those people was my great-great-grandma. Her name was Ida Kropsky, and she came over in 1910 from Belarus. She came over with 3 children, ages 7, 3, and 6 months old. The 6-month-old was my great-grandma. Ida was partially deaf and could only speak Yiddish and not a word of English. A while after she arrived, she had 2 more children and lost her husband. She tried all sorts of jobs to raise money for her family. After my grandpa was born, she lived with his family until she died. She learned a bit of English, but still wasn't very accustomed to the English language or American culture. One of the things she had a lot of trouble with was using a telephone. My grandpa remembers one particular story about her trying to use a phone.
After I had entered the freshman class, I joined a fraternity. The fraternity was 3 blocks from my home. One night we had a fraternity meeting at 7 o'clock in the evening. My uncle Isidore and his family lived around the corner from my home. That night I was eating dinner with them when the telephone rang. It was my grandmother. She wanted to speak to me. Now you have to understand that with poor hearing, even worse English, and total absence of technical understanding, my grandmother was not very talented using the telephone. When I answered her call, she said, "Come home. Someone's on the telephone and wants to speak to you." I was clearly puzzled. How could someone be on the telephone if she was using it to call me? Now you have to remember, in those days we had no caller ID, no call forwarding, no hold buttons, and certainly no call waiting. Furthermore, in our house, we only had one telephone line. It would have been completely impossible for someone to be on the telephone while she's calling me. Then I had a brilliant idea. My grandmother must have told the person calling me to wait while she put the receiver down and went upstairs to the people who lived in the apartment upstairs to use their telephone to call me. Okay, that sounded reasonable to me. So to verify it, I simply asked her, "Where are you, Grandma?" She responded with a puzzled, "What?" I repeated the question. "Where are you calling me from?" She became very irritated with what she thought was a very stupid question, and she said, "Come home. Now get home and answer the telephone." Well, when my grandmother used that tone of voice, I knew it was time to hustle over there. So I ran out my uncle's back door, leaped the fence, ran around the corner, up the steps to my house, and entered the front hall. When I did, I immediately went over to the telephone, which was sitting comfortably on the table with the receiver hung up. Very stupidly and very irrationally, but obeying my grandmother's orders, I picked up the telephone and I said, "Hello?" I heard nothing but a dial tone. So I put the telephone back on the hook and went back to my uncle's house to finish dinner. Later on in the evening, I walked the 3 blocks to the fraternity house in order to attend the meeting. Before the meeting started, my very best friend Richard came up to me and he said, "What the heck is wrong with your grandmother?" I was puzzled and I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I called you earlier to offer you a ride to the meeting. I asked for you, but your grandma probably didn't understand what I was saying, so I said it louder. I want to speak to Bart." This time she said, "Okay, wait a minute." Then she hung up the phone. Obviously, my grandmother thought that the person who had called me would still be on the line after she had phoned me to come home. These newfangled gadgets were a mystery to her.
My grandpa also remembers another story about her from when he was a young boy.
It was 1943, and my mother had invited all of my uncles, aunts, and cousins to our house for a Passover Seder. Now, one of the traditional foods that's often served at a Seder meal is a fish dish, which is called gefilte fish. That means filled fish, or fish filled with other food. It's prepared by first grinding the fish in the meat grinder, just like hamburgers are made, and then adding carrots, onions, spices, and etc. To the fish, and then molding it into large balls, like very big meatballs. They cook it, then they chill the gefilte fish, and they serve it. It's usually the first portion of the Seder meal. Now, knowing that my grandmother would like to prepare this dish, my dad announced that he and I would go, quote unquote, fishing the next morning. Now, I have to tell you, in Vermont, where it gets very cold in the wintertime, the entire Lake Champlain, freezes over. In the spring, when the ice begins to melt, the fish begin to drift upward toward the warmer waters. And that has led to a very old tradition in Vermont called pickerel shooting. What's done is this. You walk out onto the edge of the ice pack. You look for the fish as they float sleepily to the surface, and you shoot them. The bullet doesn't actually have to enter the fish. The explosion, the concussive explosion next to them, is sufficient to render them unconscious. Then you merely bend down and you scoop up the fish. That's what my father meant when he said we were going, quote unquote, fishing. Unfortunately, my grandmother knew about pickerel shooting. So she faced my father and she asked him, his name was Jacob, like yours is, only they called him Jack. She faced him and she said, Jack, how are you going to catch the fish? Now, I got to tell you, in the Jewish religion, as you probably know, certain foods are not permitted to be eaten. And even foods that are permitted must be killed in a special manner. That's the kosher law, which is spelled out in the Old Testament, chapter Leviticus. Shooting any animal is absolutely forbidden. And any animal killed that way is not kosher and cannot be eaten by religious Jews. Now, my dad was not religious. He was actually an atheist. But my grandmother was quite religious, and since she lived with us, our home was strictly kosher. Once again, she asked him, Jack, how will you catch the fish? Again, he responded, we're going to catch them with fishing poles and bait. Now, catching fish with a fishing pole is okay. That's kosher. She stared at him, not quite believing his response. So he raised his voice a bit, and somewhat irritated with her, again he said, we will catch them with a fishing rod and bait, period. So we left, and we went pickerel shooting. We caught around 12 pickerels, more than enough to make sufficient gefilte fish for the entire crowd of diners. We scaled and cleaned the fish and brought them home. Once more, my grandmother raised her eyebrows and asked my dad, how did you catch these fish? He pretended to be offended and irritated, and he said, Grandma, we caught these fish with a rod and bait. Now, don't ask me again. Later on, I helped my grandmother grind the fish using a hand grinder. She then made the gefilte fish. On the night the Seder meal was served, the large crowd gathered at the dining room table. And after the Seder prayers were said, the meal was started. Naturally, it began with a dish of gefilte fish for everyone. I hated it and couldn't eat it. Everyone was talking and laughing around the table and generally having a good time. My dad was at the head of the table, and my little grandmother was at the foot. And she was so small that only her eyes could be seen above the table. But they were dark eyes and very piercing as she checked everyone to make sure they had enough food on their plate. Suddenly she raised her voice above the general table noise, and she asked my father, "Jack, how did you catch the fish?" This time my dad really became angry, and he replied in a very loud voice, "We caught them with fishing poles. How many times do I have to tell you?" There was a very long pause, and then my grandmother reached inside her mouth and pulled out a lead slug and said, "Then where did this bullet come from?" She had the only piece of fish that contained one of our bullets. It had actually gone through the grinder and was incorporated into one of the balls of gefilte fish, the one she ate. The entire table erupted into laughter, and my dad was laughing so hard he fell off his chair.
My great-great-grandma Kropsky had lots of trouble assimilating into American culture and had lots of funny habits and traits. I'm sure she wasn't alone in this, and there were many more immigrants with her same problem.